Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Ben Saunders. I'm the co-founder of an organization called WeBuild-AI. First and foremost, I wanted to congratulate you all for making it this far over the last 2 days. I'm sure you're about as exhausted as I am. In the next 30 minutes, I'm going to share some experiences from the last 12 months since we launched our company. More broadly speaking, we're going to talk about everything from digital, data, and AI. We're going to talk a lot about product delivery, and I'm also going to give you a sense of where I think the world is going to around all these really, really profound technologies that are seemingly disrupting our everyday lives at this moment in time. I have to say co-founder because my actual co-founder is in the room, so I usually say founder, but for this presentation, I am the co-founder of the business. Sorry, Mark. So, for those of you who don't know us, we are a team of AI native solutions builders. We were launched in September of 2024, so we actually celebrated our 1-year anniversary yesterday. We typically work with enterprise organizations in order to help them modernize the ways in which they service their customers. That's broadly done through a number of highly skilled experts who are bringing into the business. Those people will typically use capabilities like agentic AI, generative AI, coding agents, etc., to deliver exponential value to our customers in accelerated timeframes. Through the last 12 months, we've honed our craft significantly, so we have a proprietary methodology that we call Pathfinder, and we harmonize that with our AI launchpad pathway, which is a multi-cloud AI native solution that resides on both AWS and Azure. So like any other solution that says it is cloud native and you can flip it at a switch, ours actually works. In terms of the things that I'm going to touch on today, so I'm going to give you a view about where we think the AI-powered future is really leading towards in the enterprise context. I'm going to share some experiences about how we approach the typical methodology for transformation. I'll also share loads of experiences where we've really got it wrong in the last 12 to 18 months. But hopefully you'll take some experiences away where you don't make the same mess ups that we did. What I'm also going to do, though, is kind of give you a viewpoint about what I think the technical blueprint looks like for the enterprise knowledge worker of the future. And that might sound like a bit of a mouthful at this moment in time, but when we start to show you that vision, it will hopefully come to life as we bring the storyboard through the conversation as well. But we are still a relatively young business, so we can have these really, really bold visions about what we think is going to happen in the world. I'm not going to focus on the one in the top left-hand corner, but when we started our company in September, we actually started to perform a series of perspective interviews with C-suite executives that we had in our network and who were really kind and generous with their time as we started to hone our idea about what we wanted to do as a business. And we wrote down a couple of vision statements about what we thought the future was going to happen. As a proxy to that, first and foremost, we said that in 5 years' time, we typically expect that 80% of enterprise applications are going to get built 70% faster and operated at 30% of their current TCO. I'm not a mathematician, but that sounds pretty good. Needless to say, when we said that to a lot of people, they laughed us out of the room, and we probably got it wrong, because that's happening today. It's not 5 years from now. We're also quite bold and bashful about what we think is going to happen in terms of how we all consume and interact with information. Full disclosure, I'm not an engineer. I like things to be really, really, really easy, and I like to get things done really, really quickly. And if I could, I would just talk to a machine. And if I spoke to that machine, I'd want it to build my charts, I'd want it to build my apps, and I'd want it to be hyper-tailored to the things that I want to do. And I think it's pretty conceivable in the next few years that we're going to see a significant disruption in the typical enterprise SaaS marketplace where we don't necessarily consume big SaaS products. We might use utility IT in that way, but we are going to build hyper-tailored, hyper-personalized applications that are built around the context of what I need, grounded in the data of the things that I've got to get done. And what we're also seeing in this moment in time, and probably more so in the last 9 or so months, is we know that the frontier model providers are running out of data. So when you start to see the likes of OpenAI and Anthropic and others partner with organizations like like Reddit, and also partnering with Thomson Reuters and the Financial Times, the power of these language models is going to continue to get exponentially more great. And when you start to think about the opportunity that we have as organizations and the need for us to drive a higher quality data set in our own respective businesses, that really opens up avenues for you to start to think about data and how you might monetize it. Particularly if you look at partnerships with other organizations, which you may never have initially conceived possible. It's not necessarily your data that's really powerful, but it's when you bring it together with other organizations that really truly differentiates the products that you might have and what you might sell. So we truly believe that from an economy perspective, organizations will really start to monetize their data as a proxy to all this stuff that is currently happening in the marketplace. But when you start your digital data or AI transformation, you probably work with a partner, they probably turn up in some suits, they've probably got some briefcases, and they've got loads of good PowerPoints, and we've got loads of good PowerPoints. But we've also got some really good experiences about building these solutions in ways that we know are truly differentiated. And when you start to think about your transformation journey, and when you typically work with organizations who are going to help you through that process, they'll always say, what do you need to get going? And you'll often hear someone say, it depends on your use case. And frankly, I'm a bit tired of hearing that because I think it's a little bit more differentiated in terms of what you typically need to build. You need something to acquire data, you need something to process your data, you need somewhere to store it, you need to analyze it. When you start to think about the common building blocks that we have available to us, you probably really only need 8 or 9 core technology capabilities for you to really maximize the value of AI-enabled product delivery, agents, and agentic AI embedded into your key business processes. And when you think about the Gen AI enablers, yeah, it can code, yeah, it has the ability to create text and content. It also has really powerful skills to synthesize and analyze data, which is probably one of the biggest ones that I make the use of it. And then we can start to create image, video, and actually synthesize voice. So when you start to see all of those things from a data context and the abilities that you have in your business, I tend to think it's probably only 3 or 4 core things that you really need. But the biggest conundrum that you always have is, how do I align that to value? How do I build common cross-cutting capabilities that make sure that the investments I make are the right investments? And ultimately, how do I build the foundations in the right way so that it isn't necessarily a siloed and an isolated capability that can't be used from one business unit to another? So we always talk about mechanisms for you to be able to drive reuse. And ultimately, any good, solid architecture is composable and is modular. And particularly when you look at a time where we are growing our concentration on a small number of trusted cloud providers, whether that be AWS, Microsoft, or Google Cloud, and even more so when you start to think about our increasing dependency on the frontier model providers, OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, etc., we need to start to build some redundancy in the system where if these things become exponentially more expensive, we can switch them out at speed. So when you start to think about the durability of your technology architecture when we're moving forward at this moment in time, modularity and composability become increasingly important. And when we talk about use cases, I'm sure that many of you in your organization have probably gone through a process of where you've basically identified 1,000 use cases across many business domains, and I can guarantee that those use cases typically fall into 5 or 6 core themes. The important thing that you need to recognize, though, is that when you build stuff, you've got to build stuff in the right order. So people talk about a product-orientated mindset, prioritizing features based on demand. Those things from a software engineering perspective are increasingly important when you start to think about products, data, and AI adoption. And I'm sure that all of you in this room have probably gone through a process of crowdsourcing ideas for AI, data, or analytical use cases in your business. And I suspect they've probably got a spreadsheet somewhere on someone's laptop, prioritized, ranked in order, mapped to the business value, and everything in between. The problem with that is that when you start to take a use case by use case approach, typically those things are isolated, they're siloed, and they're not necessarily connected to the value chain of your business. So what we typically say is when you think about all of those wonderful use cases in your organization, they often fall into 3 buckets. They're either there to help you save money, make money, or reduce risk. And the fundamental thing that you have to ask yourself in order to ensure that you are building the right things in the right order and align that to value is, why are we building this and who's going to benefit from it? And if you cannot answer that question, there is fundamentally not much purpose and much reason for the investments you are going to make on those digital data and AI initiatives. But as I said a moment ago, the key to this is, yes, I've got these opportunities. Yes, I've got the opportunity savings, but then being able to map that to your value chain. So a couple of examples here in the retail banking sector, you might have open an account, you might make a payment, you might add a payee. But when you think about the disparate business processes that exist in many, many organizations, there's probably only about 10 to 30 business processes that keep your business ticking. So if you understand that value chain and you can then start to isolate how all of those opportunities and those use cases can be stitched together, that's where you're really going to be able to reimagine how your business can change with all of these modern digital data and AI capabilities coming to fruition. And I made a pretty bold statement a second ago where I said, all of these things, they kind of map into 5 or 6 key themes. So when you think about our business processes, striping across, and you have your 1,000 use case spreadsheet and the database where this is all stored, there's typically 6 things, 5 things. When you think about content creation could be code. It could be branding and iconography for your marketing material. It could be a go-to-market strategy. It could be email, right? Content is a vast, vast opportunity for you. Then you start to think about data analysis. You could be summarizing and analyzing unstructured data. You could be bringing together structured data. You could be calculating machine learning models that help you evaluate potential entrants to new markets, etc. And then you start to think about agents and task automation. So now you start to build these micro-composable organisms, by all intents and purposes, that you can stitch together and bleed into your business processes. But then the fundamental ones, which we always kind of say you should start with, is problem solving and knowledge management. And the reason we say start with knowledge management is it's because the thing that all of these are dependent on. If you can't bring together structured and unstructured data in your business in a harmonized way, it doesn't actually enable you to do the right problem solving. It doesn't enable you to create the right content and solve the right problems. And it certainly doesn't allow you to analyze data in the ways in which your business is going to need it to. So when you bring all of this stuff together, ultimately what you're going to find over time, and I'm sure many of you have made significant investments in data platforms, whether that be something like Snowflake or Databricks. You might even just have something quite traditional like an S3 bucket where you might be dumping data as an example. These things become interconnected over time. And what you start to find is this opportunity to bring together all of these clusters of use cases by building these common, reusable, cross-cutting platform capabilities that then unlock everything. So where we had our 1,000 use case opportunity backlog a second ago, usually organizations take one of these use cases and tackle them one by one. It doesn't deliver value. It takes loads and loads of time. And before you know it, you've got these isolated technology capabilities that don't really talk to one another. So when we say build these common cross-cutting capabilities, we look at it from 8 or 9 pillars of stuff that you need to do in order to unlock what we believe to be the kind of future technology landscape. And what does that look like? So this is the money shot, and I'm sure you're probably all going to get your phones out and take a picture of this slide. But when we start to think about where we think the world is moving towards, I'm sure many of you use ChatGPT day by day. I'm sure you all use Copilot, begrudgingly, one way or another, but you don't really talk about that. And I'm sure that you might use Claude and everything else in between. But when you think about how much time you are now spending in those systems, you are becoming increasingly dependent on them. Historically, you might typically have used 5, maybe 8 applications on a day-by-day basis. The likelihood is, moving forward, you're going to use one. And that one application is going to be the single stream of consciousness where you do all of your knowledge work. That stream of consciousness is going to have access to your email. It's going to have access to your diary. It's going to have access to your resource planning system, your CRM, and you're going to be able to bring all of that information into you through one stream of consciousness. And that's becoming increasingly popular and more available through systems like MCP, Model Context Protocol as an example, where we have API to natural language integrations. But when you think about what your stack is going to look like and what you're going to use as a knowledge worker, I kind of think you're going to have 3 screens. You're going to have your AI chat where you speak to your agents. You're probably going to have some kind of knowledge management workflow where you might compose and build agents moving forward and digital workflows and that kind of consumable application. And I think you're probably going to have some kind of scratch pad, right? Where you draw your rough notes and you draw your rough diagrams. And those things, when you draw them like on a whiteboard when you're in a meeting, I hate when you draw on a whiteboard and you say, I'm just going to go to the whiteboard now and no one else can see the thing you're drawing. But ultimately, we're going to start having these rough scratch pads, which very, very quickly will create themselves in ways that we can be digitized and then we can integrate it into our experiences from a colleague perspective. So when you think about that as a knowledge worker and being able to visualize data through voice and through natural language, it kind of beggars the question, do I need Power BI? Do I need Tableau? Do I need Click? Because ultimately we are going to have agents that sit underneath our voices and are able to create graphs, visualizations, and charts in a second, because we're going to have the trusted data that sits underneath that. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail momentarily. But when you start to think about the ability to have that kind of agentic experience and those language models, that is going to take a lot of control and a lot of orchestration. And when you start to think about the opportunity that that brings, there's a couple of core capabilities that you're going to need in that sense. Some of you might have heard of things like AutoGen, you might have heard of LangGraph as an example, but when you start to stitch these agents together, they need to be composable, they need to be modular, but they need to be controlled. Because the thing that we don't want is agents going into access our top secret data, both structured and unstructured, and being able to retrieve information that they should not necessarily have access to. So having those agent frameworks is super, super, super important. But when you start to think about frameworks, you then start to think, well, if I've got an AI chat experience, I can build an agent and I can run the agent. That's pretty cool from an on-demand perspective. But what you want to be able to do is orchestrate those agents to run 24/7. And you're going to need to have agents that speak to teams of agents, that interact with other agents. And before you know it, you've got a whole ecosystem of workflows and families that need to talk to each other. So as an example, you're going to need some kind of orchestrator, a bit like Prefect, who are just over there. But the key thing is when you start to have all of this information flowing through the currency of your business, you need to be able to observe it and you need to be able to trust it. So a couple of years ago, Google created a methodology called site reliability engineering. I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with that as a concept. They talk about service level objectives and service level indicators as a mechanism to be able to test and validate the fragility and or the robustness of a technology platform. Think about that in the concept of the digital realm and the data-driven world that we're now going to. You need to be able to measure pretty much everything from that circumference standpoint. So if you think about you as a human interacting with agents, the thing that you're going to need is trust. And the thing that is going to give you trust is greater data and greater telemetry. So how long did the agent take to run? What did the agent access? What tools did it use? Where did it go to? When did it do it? How many tokens did it use? How quickly did it complete? And how frequent does that agent perform that task for me? For you to be able to work with any coworker when they create information for you in today's world, that is going to become increasingly important for you when we move to this digital ecosystem in the future. And the key thing is when we start to think about this technology stack where we're kind of thinking the world is going to move towards, you are going to have teams of agents. And I'm sure there are many, many vendors here today and suppliers, a lot like ourselves, who say they've built an agent that does one very, very specific thing. The reality is you probably only need 7 core heuristics or types of agent in your organization, and they're not telling you that. So when we talk about the agents that you need to build, you might have an orchestrator agent, so someone who's like the big boss and they control all the other agents in your business. You might have a planning agent. You might have an analysis agent. You might have the author agent. You then might have an agent that reviews what the author has created. You then have a compliance agent, and then you have a publisher agent. And ultimately, those things will work in a reflection pattern to give you a greater sense of trust and authenticity about where that information has come from. And think about agents in this technology landscape a lot like mannequins in a window. So when you go down a shop, when you go to shop at New Look, or I don't know, is New Look still open? I don't know. When you go to Debenhams, that's definitely closed. But when you go to Harrods, that one's still open. And you go past the window and they've got their beautiful Christmas display and you've got these mannequins, right? Mannequins are essentially dressed in the heuristics of your business. So think about those 7 agents in this technology stack, dressed with the knowledge and the currency and the information of your organization. If you get that right, you will only build 7 types of agents, but built and grounded in the knowledge and the expertise of your organization. The bit under here, though, is where it gets really, really complex, because when you start to think about structured and unstructured data, how do you have all of these different data objects and entities and really start to bring it together in a way in which maps the human brain? So I'm sure many of you might have interacted with systems like Neo4j, where you can start to build interdependencies and relationships of the core data patterns that exist in your business. That's where the concepts of agentic RAG and knowledge graph really kind of come together when you start to use language models to fuel the fire of this modern technology landscape. And a couple of times today, I've already started to talk about vector databases and how you might use those to help you with retrieval augmented generation capabilities and solutions. But we kind of think RAG's going to die away in the next 6 to 12 months. Very, very highly likely. You're probably going to see that organizations start to gravitate a lot more towards model context protocol. And the reason for that is because with RAG, you typically have to manage the mapping of your access controls from the document storage to how it's mapped into the RAG. That's a massive pain in the backside. So with MCP, what you actually start to do is inherit the access approvals from the document or from the object storage at source. So if you connect to a document via MCP and you don't have access to it, you can't access it. But what that starts to introduce is a super, super important consideration about the data in your business. It needs to be governed, it needs to be structured, it needs to be tagged, and it needs to be labeled, which is quite a boring exercise. But if you go back to the process that I was alluding to a second ago in terms of the 7 agent personas, there's a very, very strong likelihood that you could use an agent to do that for you. And ultimately, if you give it the guidelines, if you give it the parameters, and if you give it the context about all of the things that are in your enterprise knowledge base, whether that's SharePoint, whether that's Jira, whether that's GitHub, ultimately, it can do that tagging and labeling for you. And I'm sure that many of you have probably looked at your SharePoint instance and gone, oh, I really don't want to do that. But fundamentally, it is possible. And you could probably do about 80% of it with a language model off the shelf. But when you start to bring all of these things together, infrastructure is the backbone of it. And when we talk about those 8 or so common cross-cutting capabilities, you're going to need a data platform. That data platform is going to need to store data. You're going to need some form of visualization capability. You're going to need a data quality framework that enables you to bring all of this stuff to life so that you can guarantee the accuracy, the freshness, the completeness of that data mapped to the core data sets for you to deliver their value to your organization. From an infrastructure perspective, all of the hyperscalers have plug and play utility capabilities, which you can use off the shelf. So Azure has AI Foundry, AWS has Bedrock. You could literally spin these things up pretty quickly and do it in a declarative manner. And when I talk about that declarative manner, it's talking about things like infrastructure as code, which is where, when I was talking earlier about the reusability and the modularity of your technology standpoint, the reusability and the modularity of your technology solutions, that is super, super important. I've covered a lot of ground really quickly, and I've had the sign up a couple of times. So I'm going to pause there for a moment's breath. Just in terms of the things that we've covered today, I've talked about digital, I've talked about data, I've talked about the methodologies that I think you should probably start to consider when you want to start to deliver agentic AI into your organization, when you really want to make use of data in ways which, to be fair, you are going to speak to it and it is going to be able to build the charts for you, and fundamentally starting to give you a sense of how do you bring this all together in a technology stack that isn't just fit for purpose today, but ultimately is going to be the thing that future-proofs your organization for the next 10 to 15 years. And what I would say is there has never been a better time to just build stuff, which is why we're called WeBuild-AI. Because ultimately, we pretty much believe that you could take any concept and any idea and build a technology solution in a matter of days, as opposed to waiting a matter of months or years. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you all today. I am at booth B50. I'm going to be around here for a minute or two. It just saves me coming out and asking you a question. And if you do want to pose anything to me, then by all means, feel free to do so. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day.